was in the back. He said, "That's what she said." All right. Ladies, gentlemen, mostly gentlemen, thanks for coming. So this is one of the 27 talks regarding SSL at SaintCon this year. If you missed the other 26, I'll tell you how I'm going to differentiate in a minute. This is not going to be very serious. I'm going to be extremely informal. If you disagree or want to comment or whatever, feel free. I'll be available afterwards, so don't feel like you can't approach me and argue with me about anything I said. First of all. All right. So the modus operandi of this talk is having a tactical discussion around SSL. Essentially what I mean by that is we want to talk about how it's used in an organization, where we encounter it, and how we're going to interact with it. I'm not going to go crazy deep into the Cipher specifications. It's not going to be a theoretical conversation, but I want to talk about a few different ways that we encounter it in today's IT environment. We're going to talk about PKI, quick little overview of how we see certificates, how that's implemented. Dive into the SSL handshake a little bit and what Cipher suites play into that. And then we'll show you two different ways to do decryption with WireShark. So there's a really common way, and there's a million tutorials on the internet, and there's a slightly less common way. We'll talk about both of those. And I also want to touch on enterprise decryption, which is where we're doing wholesale decryption in a larger network. Once we get through all that good fun stuff, we're going to talk about how you can look at the SSL environment that you have and just do some basic testing. See what Cipher suites, what SSL versions are in use, et cetera, et cetera. Quick little note at the bottom. Hopefully everybody can see that. I'm going to point, so I got my little laser pointer here. I might point some stuff. Can you guys in the back see that okay? Awesome, thank you. There's a bunch of CLI commands throughout the talk. There's a little cheat sheet at the end. So don't worry about capturing any of the commands. I'll make the cheat sheet available to you all. So it's not like you have to scribble anything down the slides. If I move through it, you don't see what I was talking about. Quick little about me. I work for CompuNet. Some of you guys are customers. Some of you guys have heard of us. We're a VAR in the Valley. I'm a security engineer. I spend a lot of time dealing with network security, IPS devices, and angry packets. Jokingly refer to myself as a packet janitor because I clean up packets that fall on the floor. One of the founding members of DC 801 Labs. If you guys are familiar with the local hackspace in Salt Lake City, I'm around there a fair amount. We do Hacker Camp every year, I'm involved with that. I also mentor the SANS 560 and 542 courses.
Very good barkeep.
And a very good barkeep. I was known to bartend at DEF CON a little bit. So yeah, InfoSec prostitute, and I'm all over the place. So. Quick little thing right off the top. I'm not going to differentiate between TLS and SSL. I'm going to use the terms interchangeably. They're not the same thing. A lot of vendors use SSL to encompass the whole group. I'll probably do the same throughout the talk. So let's not be pedantic and go, you mean SSL, you mean TLS. I'm looking at you. We're going to talk about certificates a little bit. Certificates come from the X509 world, which was state-of-the-art 1988 technology that we're still using today. And when we say TLS and SSL, people automatically think, oh, he means HTTPS. Well, not exclusively. The protocol is used quite a bit more, but HTTPS is one of the most common use cases we see. So here's our timeline. If any of you folks are so inclined to buy SSL a drink or a handgun, it's officially 21 years of age, you're free to do that. Back in 1994, the folks at Netscape got together and they decided to work on a security protocol, and they developed SSL 1.0 back in 94. It's not on the timeline, it never truly existed. It was insecure from the start. If you guys are familiar with SSL, that's kind of telling of things to come. So we've got quite a bit of different versions. Our current track, what we're seeing today, is SSL 1.2 is the ratified standard. That goes back to 2008, but TLS 1.3 is in development. It's just not currently ratified. So as the standards move forward, there's a lot of differences between the versions. I could do a whole very dry presentation if everybody would like me to go into like a Ben Stein sort of mode, and we could say this Cipher suite has moved on and we use a different MAC encoding mechanism in SSL 3. But that's very, very boring and we don't have time for that. What you need to know is as we upgrade through the TLS versions, we add more support for better authentication mechanisms, better hashing mechanisms, and stronger Cipher suites, making for better encryption. Vulnerabilities. So, first and foremost, I thought it was unfair that Heartbleed had the best logo of all of our vulnerabilities. That was until I saw the Oprah SSL. I don't know if she's kind of down there in the bottom. I don't know if you can see that. So with that vulnerability, everybody becomes a CA. So it's sort of the old Oprah joke is you're a CA and you're a CA. Take it in. Let it sit for a moment. All right. So I made logos for all the SSL vulnerabilities that I thought were entertaining. But I like this slide, not because I created it, because I stole it. The content in the middle, I did the crappy artwork, but the content in the middle was written by David Holmes at Security Week, and he brought up an interesting point, is that the CVSS risk scores around SSL vulnerabilities weren't always indicative of how critical the vulnerabilities were. So he wrote his own mechanism for scoring these things, and the level is either Godzilla, Bowser, or Hello Kitty. Essentially, what he's saying is impact times exploitability is his risk number, so I times E, and he ranks Heartbleed at the top. Who's familiar with Heartbleed? Right, so what does Heartbleed do? Yeah, it leaks the private key, right? And that's bad because with the private key, if it was an RSA key exchange mechanism, we can go back and decrypt previously captured sessions. So it's a very bad vulnerability, and it's really hard to come back from. I mean, you can rekey the server to prevent future issues, but anybody that's got packet captures when that key was in use is now able to decrypt those. So he's ranking that one right at the top. So this is just an interesting breakdown. One of the things that we run into is an Oracle attack, or a padding Oracle attack, similar to Poodle, Crime Breach. And essentially with those type of attacks is we can sort of chip away at the crypto, but it may require a man in the middle or a man in the browser situation, which is less likely, and quite honestly, it's just less of an issue altogether. It takes a lot longer to get clear text data out of that. Another interesting thing about this table that I thought is look at the time frame. So these are all major SSL TLS vulnerabilities, and they're all, I mean, many of them 2014, 2015, and we're going back to 2011. So we've really seen this crypto fall down in the last few years. And, you know, that being said, we've had SSL in play for 21 years, so. Okay. This is really funny because I came in at the end of the last presentation and he also had an exhibit slide. So exhibit is making the rounds here at SaintCon, but exhibit is very meta. Yo dog, I heard you use a wrapper. So we gave you a wrap so you can wrap with your wrap. The point of that is that SSL is implemented as a protocol wrapper. So our tried and true clear text protocols are encapsulated by an SSL session. When we look at it over the wire, we see the SSL setup and teardown. Inside that is the protocols that we know and love. So here's some of those clear text protocols. So keep in mind there's a couple different implementations, and these ports, these are RFC specified ports, but they really are guidelines. I'm sure you guys in this room have a management interface on some device in your infrastructure, and it probably uses some oddball port, right? So we're going to see HTTPS traffic, we're going to see HTTP traffic, we're going to see stuff all over the place, but these are the standard ports. Okay, this is my takeaway. This is my thesis point right here. Take it in. Now, what I actually mean by this is that we have in every SSL TLS session a two-part component. We care very much about the handshake. We want to capture that and analyze that. And then from the handshake is the session data. So every time we're seeing TLS communication over the wire, essentially there's going to be a handshake transaction where the server and the client are going to make some sort of agreement on which protocols, and there's going to be a key exchange. And once they've done the handshake and they've made the key exchange, our session's in progress. So the handshake itself uses asymmetric cryptography. With most of our transactions, especially the HTTPS world, that's where we're using certificates. And once we've gone through the asymmetric portion into the session data, we're using symmetric cryptography, much less CPU intensive. And the reason that we care about this is if we're trying to analyze what's going on with this protocol, or we're trying to decrypt this protocol, we need to capture the handshake, we need to understand what key exchange was used, and then we're going to, from that, infer the session key and then decrypt the session. We don't need all of the session data, just some of it, but we do need all the handshake. So, regarding certificates, the good old public key infrastructure. So this is state of the art. Is anybody in here by show of paw born before 1988? Okay, we got a couple people that are older than PKI. Good for you. So this is really old tech that's been bolted on to the certificate world. It's basically, the job of a certificate authority is to take a public key and map it to an entity. That's all it does. It's that simple. So it's going to say, I've got this mathematical number, and I'm going to assign it to Nibble, as an example. Maybe him as a person, maybe a server, maybe an organization he's affiliated with. And it's going to put its stamp on that and say, I've associated those two, and you should trust me because I'm a certificate authority. Everything else is a scoping problem. So we have three types of certificate authorities we encounter. We have the external CA, right? And that's your VeriSign, your Entrust, your DigiCert, your GoDaddy if you're broke and desperate. GoDaddy's fine, I'm just kidding. Well, yeah. So that's an external certificate. Now what's a downside with an external certificate? Lack of control, trust. You don't necessarily control their vetting process. Cost is the big one, right? So if you guys work in an environment and you're trying to push people to actually use SSL in the environment, and they're like, I don't want to buy another certificate, let's just put an asterisk cert on everything. Yeah, cost, because you don't want to keep going back to the well every time, and oh, we got to pay for this certificate and expired, we got to renew it. So external CAs have some disadvantages. The advantage to an external CA is what we're paying for is the trust factor. We're paying for the fact that that CA should automatically be installed in the certificate store of every device in play. Whether it's our phone, our iPad, our desktop, we're paying for that level of trust. So even if you go buy a GoDaddy certificate, it's signed by GoDaddy themselves or a root level certificate that's installed in everybody's certificate store, so all the devices out there trust it. If we don't need that trust across the board, we can look at an enterprise certificate. So enterprise certificate authority is going to be something like Microsoft Certificate Services, right? And you can spin it up in your organization. It's going to be local to your organization, so people at the neighboring businesses, they're not going to trust your certificate store. But you can define the vetting process. You can say, here's what you need to go through before we're going to issue your certificate. And in the instances of lab work or research or just spinning up things for your own purposes, you can even localize it to your desktop. You can use OpenSSL, create your own certificate server and certificate authority, and issue yourself certificates. So this is my very well constructed example of a certificate authority. So here at the top, we've got Mr. Denham Jr., and he's our certificate authority, and Alice and Bob from every cryptography example ever are going to be our end users. So we're going to make an assumption here, and our assumption is that Alice and Bob already have Denham's certificate authority certificate in their local store. They already trust him. In addition, Bob already has a certificate. So Bob's been issued an identity certificate, and if you can see in that bottom corner, it's been signed by Mr. Denham. So Alice would like a certificate. So what she's going to do is she's going to generate a private key and a public key, and the public key goes in a file, and that file is the certificate signing request. She's going to send that up to the certificate authority, and he's going to look at that and go, okay, is this really Alice? Because if I sign it, I'm saying that I believe it's Alice. I'm validating that identity. He's going to go through whatever vetting process is appropriate. Some organizations, it might just be, request, click. Some might go through a more extended process. Has anybody in here ever purchased an extended validation certificate? Feels like they ask for a blood type and next of kin, right? I mean, that's a more extended vetting process. So he's going to sign that certificate. He's going to return that back to Alice. And now she's going to present that certificate if anybody's contacting her and she needs to validate her identity. Make sense? Okay, so how does it scale? Well, we run into certificate chaining. So in this instance, for this to scale up and out, it wouldn't be practical for every root certificate to issue every certificate request in the world, so they issue a signing request to an intermediate. And the intermediate takes over the job of signing identity certificates for endpoints. And so at the end, we have what's called leaves. And the intermediate certificate authority is signing that, but his certificate is signed by a root authority. So when a user connects to a service that Alice is hosting, she presents her certificate and says, oh, it's signed by Renham Jr. Goes back here, and we also present this intermediate certificate, and he says, hey, this is me, and also that's signed by a root certificate, and the theory is you already trust this root certificate, therefore you trust the chain, as long as the whole chain is complete. So this is a quick overview of what the cert looks like in a browser. PackageEditor.com is a domain name that I spun up just for testing, and so we're going to see that kind of appear over and over. So in the top, I'm gesturing at the screen down here. That's not working for you guys so well. So if I point, can you guys over here see if I point with the little pointer thing? Is that good? All right. I could do. Here, won't leave you guys out. So if we go over here, this feels weird. I'm going back to the other side. It's also backwards. So this is our certificate authority at the top. ca.packageeditor.com. So private certificate authority I've spun up and issued this packageeditor.com certificate. So we see who it was issued by. In the center section we have the certificate info. At the bottom we have the issuer info. Now what's interesting is the browser trusts this, right? So what had to happen for the browser to trust this? Yeah, this certificate authority has to be a trusted CA on this endpoint. And one thing that you guys may run into is, so this is Chrome, and with Chrome, it uses the operating system's certificate store. If you use Firefox, what does Firefox use? Its very own certificate store. Thanks, guys. So you have two places to manage that relationship. So this is what the file actually looks like in one format, and we'll talk about formats in just a bit. So on this side of the screen, we see the PEM file. PEM stands for Privacy Enhanced Mail, but you can delete that information out of your head because it doesn't matter anymore. It was a standard 20 years ago that never took off. The cool thing about PEM is it's base 64 encoded binary information. So in this, it's just base 64 encoded text. And with base 64 encoded text, we can copy paste it. So we can copy paste it from a web browser, we can copy paste it from a terminal session if we're RD'd into or SSH'd into a firewall or something. Or if it's a binary file, we might have to use a different transfer mechanism. Now, it's a little difficult to read the text. This is one of the commands that'll be at the end of the cheat sheet, but what you can see, I'm viewing the certificate using OpenSSL. And so it's taking this blob of text and it's decoding it, and it's just telling me the extensions. And this example here looks like the google.com certificate. So there's a few different file types we encounter with certificate services, but the two common ones, or the two ones that we see variants of, it's either PEM encoded, where it's going to look like this and it's going to be a blob of text, or it's binary file, and it's a dir file, and it's just binary junk. Either way, on the bottom, we see we're using OpenSSL, and when we specify the right switch for the file type, it's the exact same certificate, but we encounter these file types. In where we encounter the file type issues is moving certificates from one system to a separate system. So if you're maybe moving off a Windows server, old Windows systems really like to use dir files because they just assume that binary files were super convenient for everybody, where the open source world tends to prefer PEM files. To go from one to the other, it's really, you just base 64 decode this without the begin certificate and end certificate, or if you don't want to monkey around with that, you can just use OpenSSL, and again, the commands will be on the cheat sheet for you. So we're going to look at a sample web application. So which web application is this? WordPress, right? WordPress has got its many insecurities, but I like it because it's quick and easy to throw up a login screen. So what's wrong with this login form? It is not encrypted, not even a little bit. Okay, so if we do a packet capture and we grab the HTTP post method, what do we see? In the packet, we see the username and password, which means everybody in between us and that system can look at the packet and see the username and password. So let's take a look at that same system with a certificate installed. And now this is what the session looks like with TLS in place. So we've got the three-way handshake at the top. So TCP's established, and then we see a client hello, and that's the beginning of the session. Now, then we see a TCP acknowledgement, and then we see an alert. This alert message can actually be disregarded. This is a server hello message. It's a bunch of messages at once, but it's the server hello responding. And then they're going through a key exchange, and we see the application data flowing. So when we break it down and we go to look at what's inside the packet, we see encrypted data. So it makes it a little bit different. Now, one thing that people don't always understand when we're talking about SSL or TLS, we can still learn a fair amount about what's going on inside of this traffic, even though I can no longer see the username and password, but I can see the source IP, the destination IP, the source port, the destination port, and I can see how much traffic went through. So if I see a user exfiltrating many, many gigs of data and it's SSL, I don't necessarily need to know what all the data was to know it was probably not ideal. So here's the SSL handshake broken down. Now the very specifics of this are going to change as key exchange mechanisms change, but essentially, and just like we saw in this packet capture, the client is the initiator. So the client starts off the conversation and say, here's some TLS versions I support, and here is the supported ciphers that I'd like to converse with. Server takes a look at that and responds, says, I like this cipher. Sounds good. By the way, here's my certificate, and I'm going to kick off key exchange. And basically, depending on what mechanism, the key itself might, if it's RSA, the key is going to be generated from the server's private key. If it's a Diffie-Hellman key exchange, the key is generated from ephemeral data, meaning a pre-master secret that's generated on the fly. And that makes it a little bit more difficult to decrypt, but we'll get into that in just a minute. So from that response, the client looks at that and goes, oh, okay, here's my side of the client key exchange. And by the way, I'm going to change Cipher spec. I'm ready to start having the encrypted conversation, and I'm done. Server goes, okay, sounds good. Change Cipher spec. I'm ready to start having encrypted conversation, and I'm done. That's a very high-level example, but this diagram is right out of the RFC. So if you want to get crazy bananas and understand every single transaction back and forth, I recommend the RFC and maybe some caffeine. This is what just happened. Essentially what we, again, this is my thesis point. I aim for the stars with this talk. Asymmetric cryptography, create and share a session key, right? Now we've got our session data flowing, we get back to symmetric cryptography, less CPU intensive, and we're exchanging encryption data. Okay, Cipher spec. The Cipher spec is giving us the behaviors of both the handshake and the session data. And that's what I broke out these helpful little orange and blue color boxes. Is anybody horribly colorblind and can't see the difference between those two? It's the gray and the darker gray one. So the first section here, and this screen popped out of Firefox. My personal preference is looking at this certain Firefox. Chrome writes it out backwards. The way that these Cipher specs are listed, if we look inside the handshake or looking at it in WireShark, looks a little bit more like this. For some reason, Chrome just kind of writes out their own little freeform version of this. I don't like that as much. But anyhow, the asymmetric portion of this, TLS ECDHE, so that's elliptical curve Diffie-Hellman ephemeral data. One thing that's a little tricky is they also specify RSA. That's not an RSA key exchange, that's RSA signing for authentication purposes. And over on the symmetric side, we're specifying, okay, AES, and that's the algorithm we're going to use. 128 is key size, GCM is the mode, and SHA-256 is our hashing mechanism for validity of the data. So what I want you guys to take away from this is not the innards of the Cipher spec, but I want you to know that this first part is the handshake, and the second part is the session. Good? All right, calm down, everybody. Did they serve morphine during lunch? Yeah? Okay. Chrome has an identification for what they consider a modern cipher suite. Agree or disagree? If you want to get deep into the cipher suites, there's a lot of different reasons. Certain boxes that do SSL offloading will only support certain specifications. And because of the CPU intensity level of either the key exchange or the cipher itself, some organizations like Amazon, they might downgrade their connection a little bit because they can get more connections per box. So there's a lot when you get into the tuning aspect of it. But what you need to know here is that if you're playing around in Chrome, you'll see something that looks good. Oh, I'm running TLS 1.2. Oh, wait, but it's obsolete. So Chrome in the documentation actually calls out TLS 1.2 using elliptical curve, Diffie-Hellman with ephemeral, key exchange, and using AES. Now, this connection that's obsolete was using RSA as the key exchange mechanism. When we use RSA as the key exchange mechanism, that results in a predictable session key because that session key is generated from the server's private key. So if we're ever able to recover the server's private key, we can decrypt every single session. When we talk about Diffie-Hellman, the ephemeral part of it means that those numbers are changing every single time. So every session is using a different set of pre-master keys, resulting in a different session key. So there's still ways to decrypt it, but it's a little bit more tricky. Okay, just to reiterate what I was saying. So we're going to jump into WireShark and talk about decryption. Has anybody done decryption with WireShark? Show of hands. Couple folks? Is everybody else in the room mildly interested? Yay, decryption with WireShark. So there's a WireShark lab going on next door. Please don't leave right this second. But I talked to Troy yesterday, who's leading the WireShark lab. If you guys want more stick time with this, he's actually going to go over a few examples on the second half of the session. So after I'm finished, he's going to talk about actually doing this. I will have copies of the slides available, and you pretty much can do it step by step with what's on here. But if it's something you're interested in, want to play around with, we'll definitely have some resources for you. So when we look at the cipher spec used in this conversation, we see that it's TLS RSA. So this is actually the RSA key exchange mechanism, which means what? It means that the session key is predictable. So if we can get that server's private key, we can decrypt that session. Yeah, Heartbleed would be a great example of how to get the server's private key. If you find a Heartbleed vulnerable system, you can extract the private key that way. Or, you know, my favorite is auditing network systems for customers, and they just have a wide open IT file share, and there's the server certificate, and right next to it the server key, because they've installed it on 75 systems and they need to keep it handy. So where you store your keys is definitely important. So to decrypt in WireShark, this is really pretty straightforward. Grab your packet capture. Now, one thing that's important with your packet capture, you need to have the handshake and the actual session data. So you want to get from the beginning of the session where there's a handshake, or you want to force the handshake to occur. So if we go into WireShark Preferences, Protocols SSL, we get this little dialog. We go into the RSA keys list, we edit that. The only thing notable here, we're going to add the server's IP address. We say port 443, and we're going to specify the protocol that's inside the SSL session. So we're not going to say HTTPS, because that's not the protocol that's in there. It's HTTP inside there. I'm just pointing to the server's private key file. And now looking at that, we see our package editor log on. We can tell this was an encrypted session. We see the TLS record layer. And then we see our HTTP post method. In our HTTP post method, we can see admin password. So that's decryption with an RSA key exchange. Now, if we jump into the Diffie-Hellman, this works a little bit differently. Here we don't have a dependency to have the server's private key. But what the dependency we do have is we're going to ask for the pre-master secrets from the client. So the client will tell us the pre-master secrets. We're going to leak those from the browser. We'll create those, we'll dump them all into a file, and we'll load that file back into WireShark. And WireShark will use those pre-master secrets to figure out what the session key was. So very first thing, we start our packet capture, and then we're going to use the export command, and we're going to do export SSL keylog file. So that's going to create an environment variable and output it to a file. If Chrome or Firefox sees that variable, they will output all the session keys to that variable. Well, that could never be abused, right? So what we want to do is we want to launch Firefox from the same session, and that's going to make sure that we have visibility into that environment variable. We're going to start browsing around, and what I like to do is fire up another terminal window, and then I'll run tail-f, and that just shows me the file being populated. So once we go through this, we can stop, save the packet capture, and then we go back to this screen, same spot WireShark, WireShark Preferences, Protocols SSL. We're going to ignore that RSA keys bit, and we're going to down here and enter in these pre-master secret log. Specify that file, and now we can see, all right, so in this slide I'm showing that. All right, okay, just go ahead and resize on the fly there, that was fun. In this slide we're looking at the elliptical curve Diffie-Hellman algorithm or cipher suite is in use. So if we look right here, we see RSA is the signing mechanism but not the key exchange. So we see basically that's assuring us that we're using ephemeral keys. The keys are being dynamically changed. So opening that up, looking at our submission, we see that I have detected somebody logging in to my WordPress site with the username Pope, password funny hat. Now, one thing notable when we are talking about the ephemeral keys. Ephemeral keys aren't relying on the server private key. And so, yeah, great, that was an example from my system that I host, but take a look at this. This is Netflix. Okay, so here's a Netflix logon. We can see the Netflix URL, we can see it's an HTTPS connection, and we can see Pope at Vatican.com signing into his Netflix account, password funny hat. My apologies to the Pope if that's actually his Netflix password. So, any questions on decryption within WireShark? Two different common methods, different set of dependencies. That makes sense? All right. So now I'm going to touch on decryption with the next-gen firewall. This could be a load balancer. There's a couple different firewalls that can do this from a few different vendors. I'm going to give you a specific example around doing it with Palo Alto. That's a platform I work on a lot, but it's not exclusive to that platform. There's really, we talk about enterprise level decryption. There's two types of decryption we encounter often, and that's inbound service decryption. So users out on the internet, and we want to inspect their traffic before we have them connect to one of our servers or services. Or outbound decryption, where our users are reaching out to the internet and they're accessing all sorts of who knows what. And we want to decrypt those sessions, making sure that it's not command and control traffic or exfiltrating chunks of data or some malware or whatever. So first, let's start with inbound. So with inbound encryption, what we are doing is we are moving the server's certificate and private key up to the firewall, and the firewall is going to stand in between the server and the users on the outside. It'll decrypt the inbound sessions, inspect the traffic, and then re-encrypt it and hand it off to the server. Variations are often done of this methodology with load balancers for SSL offloading. We're starting to see more of a requirement to actually encrypt and then decrypt and re-encrypt, just because we don't want to have clear text traffic traversing the inside of our network. So that is what is happening here. And the reason that's interesting, so I use my crappy little WordPress logon as an example here. And what I did is I decrypted the traffic, and then I went outside the network, and I fired off a brute force login attack. And so what we can see is that the IPS took action, it reset both sides of the connection, and it detected the vulnerability specific to the WordPress login brute force. So it said, hey, wow, that's a lot of logins happening in a very short period of time. Would that have happened without decryption? No, it wouldn't happen, because all it would see is just inbound SSL. Oh, hey, SSL, that's from this server over here. Here you go. It would just broker the connection all the way through. Only because we decrypted it, we inspected it, it said, hey, wow, that's a lot of HTTP posts with the same values from the same client. I don't like those conditions. Boom, TCP reset both sides. My crappy WordPress blog is protected. One other little thing, we also have a packet capture option here. So when we trigger an alert with Palo Alto, we can grab a packet capture for the higher severity alerts. You can tune that to whatever severity you want, but by default, it'll grab it for the higher ones. So looking at the packet capture, we just have one packet, but inside we can see the username and password. So once again, evidence that we're decrypting, right? Logins admin, password is Jeremy monkey stomping on the keyboard. Okay, outbound user decryption. Outbound encryption is a little bit different, because instead of moving our certificate for our server up to the firewall in this instance is going to become the certificate authority. Everything the users are looking at, the firewall is going to decrypt it, inspect it, and then sign it with its certificate authority and pass it back to the user. So what that means is, if your users don't trust the certificate authority, they're going to get a lot of invalid certificate messages when you turn this on. So here's what we see. I'm browsed out to Facebook. You can see that this is the Facebook certificate, and right in the center, it's Menlo Park. Facebook certificate is intact. They're using an asterisk cert, which bad practice, Facebook. And here we see the issuer is packagejanitor.com. Now, from the client's perspective, the client trusts this certificate authority, so all is good. Everything is green. The client doesn't notice unless they're inspecting the certificates on the fly, unless they're digging into there going, is this really who it says they're supposed to be? And most clients are not. There are some protections for adding certificates to the certificate store, but it's, with group policy or MDM tools, it's fairly trivial to manipulate your clients and add certificates to their local stores. Okay, same example with Twitter. Certificates intact. We see that the issuer is packagejanitor.com, and the client experience is unscathed. It looks exactly as it would normally. You wouldn't know that the decryption had taken place unless you inspected the certificate. And same thing with Wells Fargo, right? Trusted financial institution, we go ahead, we decrypt, and because I'm a CA locally on the box, it says, oh, all is well. But we don't want to do that. So as best practice, we don't really want to decrypt financial information or healthcare information unless there's a really interesting use case, because that puts a lot of liability on us as the infrastructure owners, potentially having data that's more sensitive than we want. Certificate pinning. Everybody heard of certificate pinning? Have a clue what that is? Yeah? It's the SSL bomb, right? So certificate pinning is essentially the concept of saying, I'm not going to necessarily worried about CAs or whatever. I'm going to say, this is the certificate I expect, and I'm going to hard code it in my application. So if you present me something else, I'm going to blow up and not work because this is the only certificate I want. So a good example of this is the Dropbox, we call it the thick client, the actual Dropbox sync agent. So not the web interface, but the program that you install. And so in this instance, we see that we have our SSL session, client hello, server kicks the certificate back. Client goes, whoa, that's not cool, I'm out, fatal. And let's look at the specific error message. Oh, one more thing I wanted to show you on the previous slide. So here, we can see signed by packet janitor, right? So certificate, this is Dropbox certificate up here in this first attribute. Second one, we see packet janitor, so that was the CA. So that's where it's thrown a fit. In the actual error message, unknown CA. So that's certificate pinning in use. Honestly, the way around that is we know what Dropbox is. We know what Dropbox's servers are. We know what to look for with that application. We just don't try and decrypt it, and that fixes that. All right, testing SSL. The first point I think is the most important. Are we using SSL/TLS where we should? There are a lot of network services out there that transmit more information than should be just thrown all over the network. So one thing to look at is what clear text information is even flowing on your network. Second question, do we support strong ciphers? So is the SSL version we're using, is it modern and appropriate? And the cipher suite selected, is that as strong as we need it to be? And third question, how's our PKI deployment? Certificates are finicky little things. They have expiration dates, and they have dependencies with chains, and sometimes they have host names that don't match the name people are using to connect to the device. So we want to check all those things. Because what we don't want is we don't want a culture with our users where they open up their browser, they get the big certificate warning screen, and they click right past it. That's what we want to avoid. So for some basic testing, just scoping some things out on your network, we can use Nmap TAC SV and just look at services, just do a quick service audit on a system. There's a lot of tools that'll do this, but this is a good free one. The TAC-V gives us a list of services that are running, and we can see here that we've got 2 different LDAP instances on 2 different ports using SSL. So now let's dive a little deeper and test the SSL health on those systems. So 2 tools to do that. Nmap and SSL scan. Anybody ever used either of those? A couple people. Okay. So with Nmap, we have a couple scripts, NSE scripts that we can kick off. The SSL cert script will pull the script down, or I'm sorry, pull the certificate down. And the SSL enum script, or enum ciphers, will go through and enumerate all the supported ciphers. Essentially, these 2 tools are doing very similar tests. I prefer SSL scans, included in Kali. It's available on SourceForge. I like it just because it uses color. It's just easier to read. Go ahead and look at all the red ciphers and go, ooh, red's usually bad. Oh, we got some yellow. Yellow's okay. I should look at that. But hey, green's good. There's some green up there. Not vulnerable. That's good too. So. Absolutely, yeah. Both of these we can specify any ports. It's not tied to any ports at all. So. We can throw it at whichever services we want. So if we wanted to test, the question was, will SSL scan do non-standard ports? Yeah, we can point it at like 636 or 3269 or whatever, which are the LDAP-S server ports, whatever instances you find. So your methodology here is to use Nmap, look for services using SSL, and then go back either with an Nmap or with an SSL scan and test those instances and make sure they're using secure versions, make sure the certificates are good. If you have a vulnerability management program and you have a large-scale vulnerability management tool like a Nessus or a Nexpose, they will do all this for you and automate it and give you nice, pretty reports. But not everybody has that, so here's a couple of open-source ways to go about it. Now, anything public-facing, if we're out there facing the internet, this is a great site. So trustworthyinternet.org is partially funded by Qualys. They threw a bunch of money at this. But one thing they threw at it that's cool is the SSL Labs test engine. So if you go to trustworthyinternet.org and you look at SSL Pulse, essentially what this bar graph is showing you in this little pie chart They took the Alexa top 1 million websites, and of there they grabbed all the SSL instances, and they took 143,000 of those, and they test those on a regular basis. Of that group, that just smattering, that sample across the internet, they found that about 30% had acceptable cryptography in place facing the internet. So there's a lot of people not doing so great with their SSL deployments, and either their deployments are behind the times, or they're supporting some really old clients that are negotiating weak ciphers. So let's go ahead and run a test and see what that looks like. So throwing a domain at that, the domain of my employer, which I'm sure they gave me permission to test. I'm still seeing it up here. Okay. Just testing to see if I'm paying attention. So we see supported protocols, and we see protocols not supported. Well, we saw protocols not supported. Okay, so right here on the bottom, we see that SSL3 is not supported, and essentially we know that it's SSL3 that's not supported because of Windows XP. So it gives it a grade A, strong cipher suite, good cipher specified. So it's a quick, easy test, and this is free and available for web applications. You know, the bad news is it doesn't work great for internal custom apps, things like LDAP, etc. But for outside public-facing stuff, it's a quick, easy test you can run. One side note on that, they do have the wall of shame. By default, you're not going to wind up on the wall of shame. This little box is checked. Just make sure it stays that way. I'm not really sure if somebody doesn't like these folks and is testing them and putting them on the wall of shame, or maybe they just don't like themselves. I don't really know. But let's look at one of the bad reports. So this particular host got an F, and there was a bunch of different vulnerabilities. Essentially, the biggest issues we saw were it'll downgrade to SSL3, which is very weak, and it's also using RC4 across its cipher suite, and so those are bad things. This may have been a deliberate choice. They might have decided, hey, I think this is University of Phoenix, I'm not sure. Maybe they have an AV program we could sign up for. And so they decided that they were going to go through and test, and it might have been a deliberate choice to say we need to support Windows XP. Maybe they have old clients that they can't kick out of school. Maybe they have projector issues. I don't know. Just now, huh? All right, so the whole time. It's just been breaking the sweat. So this is the cheat sheet with all the CLI stuff I promised you guys. This is essentially, I put a bunch of OpenSSL commands on here. This is the stuff I encounter all the time. This is the stuff I want to share with people. Converting file formats is something we seem to run into a lot. We're moving certificates around between two separate systems, load balancers, IPS, etc. I also have how to set up a CA with OpenSSL, some basic SSL scan commands, some basic Nmap commands. I welcome any and all feedback. If there's anything interesting you want to see, I'll add it to this. All this is going to be available later today up on sobit.org, and I know it'll be in the conference material as well. So, any questions on any of this stuff for me? Yes, sir.
What about, you were talking about SSL encryption for the server side.
Uh-huh.
If you have PFS, now you would render that off the business, right? Unless you actually terminated the SSL of that gateway. Let's say you have some kind of load balancer or whatever, terminated there, then it's unencrypted on the back end.
Right. Right, yeah, so the question was around using PFS and SSL offloading, and that's one of the limitations we see, particularly with the security appliance and that inspection, right, is I didn't really touch on this, but when we decrypt with the Palo Alto, we're downgrading the key exchange to RSA. And essentially what happens in that instance is if you don't use the RSA key exchange mechanism, it just doesn't, it's not able to decrypt it because it's using PFS and ephemeral keys. So yeah, there are instances where you have to carefully architect that if you want to have the strongest possible encryption, but then also use decryption devices within your architecture. So.
I don't know if this affects anything, but do you know anything about OCSP and stapling to avoid minute in the middle? So basically, people say, okay, we're just going to DOS the OCSP servers.
Right.
We're going to present the fake certificate that you can't validate.
Right, right. Okay, yeah. So the question's on OCSP stapling, and OCSP has to do with certificate validity checking, right? Yeah, and so if you can DOS the path and basically provide an illegitimate OCSP response and you do not have OCSP stapling, there's a couple different conditions going on there, right? But yeah, that's a completely legitimate point. If you don't have OCSP stapling enabled on your device, which is a little tricky, essentially you could man in the middle the OCSP part, which doesn't allow the server to validate the validity, whether or not the certificate's been revoked. And so you could be authenticating with a revoked or illegitimate certificate. If you want to talk more or hear more about that, Moxie Marlin Spike has, let me go forward. There's a couple of talks here. Moxie Marlin Spike hits that way better than I ever could, but he talks about specifically the OCSP issues and a bunch of other trust issues in PKI in general. So yeah, great points, man. Cool. Anything else? Awesome. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. Thanks for staying awake.